Hey everyone, it is the History Nerd, and welcome to a brand new show that I'm thinking of doing. This is going to be the first test of it, but it stems from my rather atrocious Civ 5 Let's Play. The big issue with that game was I love Civ, but I really also enjoy answering your guys' questions. The unfortunate thing is, when I want to answer your guys' questions adequately, I've got to think about them. And I can't really think about them and play a game like Civ at the same time. Unfortunately, I'm not that smart. So instead, I've decided to do this where I will record the answers to your guys' questions and then toss in some random game. Haven't decided what game I'm going to use yet, but whatever I've decided is what you guys are watching. So I hope you enjoy, and I think this will give me a better chance to answer your guys' questions more adequately. So, taking a look at the questions on my Germany redo part 1. I'm not going to answer any Civ related. I'll save those for my gameplay. But for some of these questions, they take a little bit more thought than just, what my favorite Civ is and what I like doing or sharing Civ stories, stuff like that. They take, they require more thought from me. So, let's start off with my good friend Matt. Any comments on the? I believe you're asking about the Italian front in World War I not being in your history book, and you want to hear a little bit about the Italian front. To be honest, my understanding of the Italian front is a little vague as well. I focused mainly on the Western German front. Well, Western front in France and Belgium and that area. I think that's where most of the World War I focus is, which is unfortunate because, I mean, it's World War I for a reason. This war happened across many theaters throughout the world. Now, the Italian front is kind of interesting. That's where there was more Austrian involvement, fighting in the northern Italian Alps. What I do know is Italy kind of flip-flopped on their sides, which is something they're known to do, at least in the first half of the 20th century. And I think why your history book doesn't cover it is because historians don't feel that it's actually as important. At least sorry, here I am typing away. At least not when it comes to changes in the this is why I don't know enough about this. I'm gonna be honest with you. I should have done some research before recording. That being said, the Italian. So, you've got the European front, or the French, let's just call it the Western front. You've got the Western front, and from the Anglo perspective, from the German perspective, from the French perspective, that was the front. That was the meat grinder. And so that's where you see a lot of the focus coming from. The Italian front was kind of this third front, right? So you've got the Eastern Front, which was not very trench-based. It was more open, and that's where you have Germany and Russia obviously duking it out, and it was more of a fluid front. So it was kind of like a mix between Napoleonic-style fighting and World War II style fighting. So more grand movements and things like that. You have to remember the whole trench system, going on a little bit of a tangent, stemmed from militaries still fighting with Napoleonic ideas and Napoleonic tactics with equipment that made no sense with. Lining up massive formations of men and marching them across plains was bad enough with muzzle-loaded muskets. And it got worse, obviously, with bolt-action rifles. The moment you add machine guns to the mix, It's a ridiculous idea. So the Eastern Front, there was more movement going on, and then you've got other fronts that garner attention. Mainly Turkey, the Dardanelles campaign with Gallipoli, because that was a horrible failure, and that was probably one of the worst meat grinders of the war. Now the Italian campaign, there's not a lot going on there, so loading up the wiki page, because this is where I get most of my information. It looks like you've got basically 5 million combatants on the Allied side and 8 million on the Central Power side. So it's not that big of a front. It certainly sounds like a lot of people, but when you spread it out over the entire area, all things considered, it's not that big. And there's not a lot of action going on in this area. It's really a stalemate. You know, just two sides shooting each other, blowing each other up because of the terrain. Northern Italy is pretty mountainous, and so you've got the trench-style warfare coming from the Western Front in mountains, which just adds a whole other layer of it's really difficult to kill and take ground. It's hard enough to do on plains. You do it in a mountain, it's, you know, a million times more difficult. So I think why we don't see much on the Italian campaign is because just not a lot happened. And I mean, obviously from a historical perspective, there's always something happening and there's always something worth looking into, but from a course on history's perspective, there's not a lot to talk about, which is a shame, because, you know, every aspect of history is important, and you need to understand as much as you possibly can to gain an understanding of the whole. And, you know, to ignore something like the Italian campaign, you're ignoring, what did I say, 5 and 8 million? Like, you're ignoring the pain and suffering of a number of millions of humans. And history, first and foremost, is to remember what happened before. Like I said, there's just not much about that. So yeah, I think that's why you don't see a lot about it, and it's something that I don't know a lot about, and it's probably not a good thing. I should do some reading on the Italian front in World War One. I need to do more reading on World War One in general. It's one of the most interesting historical times and periods for me, and I can just eat up anything and everything that's written on it. The unfortunate thing is it's overshadowed by World War II. And I mean that's a great disservice. World War One was far more devastating, and less is known about it. I think because it's a complicated war. It's a complicated war without clear winners and losers, without clear, well, no, with clear winners and losers, but without clear bad guys. And, you know, World War II, you've got the clear bad guy. You've got the group of people who want to exterminate entire groups of people. That's pretty easy to take a stand against. Now I think I can transition here to a question on the other Civ game. Let me just load that up. So on Civ 5, or yeah, it's my Civ 5 Germany Part 5. I've got a few more questions. Monty Productions. You want to know about Joseph Stalin? What exactly made him such a bad dictator? He modernized Russia much like what happened in Japan. And so let's tackle that first. So Joseph Stalin, what made him bad? Quite a lot of things. And I think to say that his modernizing process was a lot like Japan does a great disservice to the amount of people that Joseph Stalin directly or indirectly killed. Uh, to put it bluntly. For example, Stalin's redistribution schemes. Yes, they were instrumental in kickstarting the industrialization and modernization of the Russian economy. However, they were also instrumental in killing many millions of people, uh, because basically all of the food coming from the bread baskets of Russia were being shipped into the urban centers, the places where industry was being built up. Now, a lot of this was necessary, and Stalin had to encourage a great many people to move into the cities and get work building things. The trick was when you take away an entire region's food, a lot of those people aren't going to make it. One of the sad necessities of human life is the requirements of fuel, and you take that away, and people aren't going to be able to actually survive. So there's that. There's his great purges of the Russian military, which also led to a lot of the initial failings of the Red Army when the Germans invaded. You know, in 41, when Barbarossa kicked off, the Red Army was still lacking in good leadership, especially in the mid levels. So the generals had kind of recovered, and you can always trust that your NCOs and your low level officers, so basically the grunts on the ground, they're going to develop the leadership as they fight, and they need the experience of actually fighting a war to get that. But your mid-level, you can train for that before the war, and Stalin's purges caused a great many of experienced military minds to be killed. And then when you're fighting a military that's been at war for 3 years and has the experience of fighting a war without having a trained mid-level officer corps, it's just going to be insanity. And I'm not going to say that's the sole reason that the German advance initially was so successful, but it played into it. And I think, you know, those two things are just two examples of the things Stalin did. He certainly wasn't by any means a benevolent dictator. He was a dick, plain and simple. If you didn't agree with him, you died. And in that sense, he's a lot like Hitler. It's one of the interesting points of history, I think, where only now are we starting to get an understanding of just how bad Stalin was. For the purposes of fighting the war, you know, it was kind of necessary for the West to portray Stalin during the war as, you know, oh well, he's just doing this because he has to, and he's fighting the Nazis, so he's on our side. You know, certain figures show Stalin's death count to be higher than Hitler's. He was certainly just as power hungry and power crazy, and yeah, I really don't think you can compare the modernization of the Soviet Union and say it's the same as the Japanese model. And I think it's dangerous what we're seeing in Russia now with a leadership cult growing up around Stalin. Anyone who any group who idolizes a leader like Stalin, that gets dangerous. That gets really dangerous, especially in a state like Russia. They're in a very, very difficult position these days, and they've finally gotten over the loss of the Soviet Union, geopolitically speaking. Of course, I'm not. When I talk about a nation, I don't talk. I talk more about their position geopolitically and what they're doing and what their governments are doing, not so much the people themselves. You can see, I mean, there's all sorts of people in Russia. There are people who think that reinstituting the Soviet Union would be the best thing for it. There are people who want to see true democracy in Russia, and you can see this everywhere in the world. People always have different opinions, and obviously that's not my perspective on things. I take things more from a geopolitical sense. Geopolitically, you can see Putin encouraging this idealization of Stalin and this leadership cult growing up around Stalin because it suits his ends, which is a reinstitution of the Soviet Union. And it's just scary to see Russia go that way. It's concerning, but you know, it makes sense. Living in the times we're in, it absolutely makes sense. Now, what do I think would have been different with Russia had Lenin lived for another 20 or 30 years? Certainly you would have seen more Trotsky influence in the Soviet Union. But I mean, that's tough to say. Lenin is an interesting figure. I mean, he was idolized in the Soviet Union, and to an extent he still is today. Uh, you know, you wouldn't have seen you wouldn't have seen the Stalinist state rise up. Certainly, perhaps we would have seen different revolutions in China and the Far East. North Korea might be a bit more open, but if we add 20 years to Lenin, so that puts him ruling into 1944, I do believe. So, we've got Lenin 1944, even 1954. So we've got Lenin fighting through World War II. To face the German onslaught that was coming, I mean, I really don't think things would have gone differently in Germany had Lenin been around. So we likely still would have seen the rise of Nazism. Russia, for all the bad things that Stalin did, I'm not sure how else the Russians would have been able to hold back the Germans. Now, that being said, Russia always has two great advantages, in that it's massive and the weather. So, I mean, chances are, regardless of when they would have invaded, to imagine a situation where Germany would have been able to pull off a victory in the East, you would need a lot of changes on the Western Front. Just putting Lenin in charge of the Soviet Union instead of Stalin, that's not enough. The Soviets still likely would have won. Would Lenin have been as forceful in his in his forced industrialization? I don't know. It's difficult. It's really difficult to say how different it would have been. It certainly would have been different. There may not have been as The purges may not have happened. The Soviet Red Army may have been able to stand up to the Germans earlier, although you'd still need to get the industrial complex built up for them to be able to do that. So who knows? It's a really fun thought exercise, but yeah, you know, it's difficult. It's difficult to say, but it definitely would have been different. And I do wonder if the purges would have been as strong, and if the forced industrialization would have been as strong coming from Lenin. Who knows? But it's an interesting thought exercise. I'll have to ponder that more and see if I can come up with a better answer for you. Could I read the questions in the future? Yeah, absolutely, Monty. I will do my best to do that. And I think with the format of this series, it's going to be a lot easier for me to do. So, what else have we got? Okay, so why does the US and most of the West continually support Israel instead of denouncing them and gaining favor with Arab countries? Now that's an interesting question. I think they do it because they're on our side, politically speaking. Politically speaking, Israel is a Western nation. And the support from the US in that region is because they're really the only government in the region that is like us, and that we can safely assume will be pro-West. And I think that's the reason why we see the strong support. Now, we are starting to see, especially in Europe, an acceptance of the idea of a Palestinian state, of a two-state solution, which I think is the only way to go about doing this. We can get into crazy theories, of course, that they're all conspiring together and such. And I mean, in a way they are, because they're all the same, politically speaking. But I mean, I don't think it's a gigantic Zionist conspiracy run from the U.S. I think it more has to do with just simple politics, in that the United States feels that, and I mean, it's not just the U.S., right? Canada feels the same way, is that they're our best friend in the region, and that, you know, the chances of anti-American protests coming up in the streets of Tel Aviv are pretty low, to be honest. Much lower than in the streets of Cairo, as we can see. So I think that's why there's the undying support for Israel. I'm not sure that that's really going to continue, and it's putting the Western nations that do unequivocally support Israel in a very difficult position. Because Israel's making it very difficult to continue to support them. Which is why I'm very excited for the election, the Israeli election in January. And hopefully they can... Hopefully the people of Israel can have their voices heard and move away from these hardline... I don't like using the term right or left wing, but these hardline militant political groups that feel the only way for Israel to survive is to conquer. There are other political groups in Israel. There are other political parties and political organizations who feel that a two-state solution is the only way to go. And I think if you want a lasting, peaceful situation in the Middle East, that is the only way to do it. And both sides have to realize that they're going to have to give up something for the other. Now, if we continue to see coming from Israel the policy of militantism and hard line, conquest positions, we're never going to see peace in the region. But the moment that we can get both parties to sit down and talk without shooting missiles at each other, I think that's going to be a step in the right direction. And both sides have to realize that that they need to give something up. And once we get to that point, things are going to be much better, I think, anyway. But I mean, as for why we do it, because geopolitically it makes sense. We know they're always going to have our back in the region, so we have their back. But it's starting to shift. The US will probably be the last country, or the second last country, to blindly support Israel. Germany kind of always has to. And it's a little unspoken geopolitical rule that Germany supports Israel. For obvious historical reasons, I think we can all agree. Canada, usually, before Harper came along, we weren't lockstep in with Israel, but as long as Canada has a majority conservative government, we're going to be. And then all those little Pacific nations that that support Israel to the last, they're basically American colonies, and that's why we see them doing that. So slowly but surely, the hardline position, as Israel continues in their policies of especially the settlement issues, and that's the thing that I would hope would be resolved with a different political party after an election in Israel, is that they can step back from putting settlements in Palestinian lands and using that as a justification for their militant stance. That's my thoughts on it anyway. IALSs. Did I hear about the school shooting? Yes, absolutely. And it's horrific. It's when you read something like that in the news, it's difficult to comprehend, it's difficult to process, and it's difficult to understand how something like that can happen. You know? Like, that... It doesn't make any sense, right? Now, your second question, how do you prevent something like that? That's a tricky one. Because, I mean, take a look at what happened in China with the school stabbings. So we have two different events. Well, we have two very similar events happening half a world away from each other, one with a gun and one with a knife. Now, the situation in China, these 20 school children who were stabbed, I don't believe any of them have died. So it looks like they're all going to survive. Physically anyway, the trauma associated with those 20 kids who've been stabbed, they are going to have a very difficult life. Now, the trauma for everyone in Connecticut who lost a loved one, that's going to be incredibly difficult as well. I don't want to take away from the suffering there. How do you prevent it? There's lots of talk now about gun control and how we need to get guns out of the hands of everybody, really. Now, the societal issue is, because of the Constitution, guns are very much a part of the American society. I mean, guns are a part of America, and their society has been built around this idea that the possession of weapons equals freedom. Now, it's an interesting stance to take. And remember, when the Constitution was written, guns were much more difficult to use in a mass killing type situation. The British regulars, for instance, could train. And they did train to be able to fire off 3 rounds a minute. That's not a lot of rounds. Now, with a muzzle-loaded rifle, that's incredibly quickly. 3 rounds, when you consider what you've got to do to arm a muzzle-loader, that's insane. But let's take a look here. One of the weapons used in the school shooting was a Bushmaster 223 rifle, or basically the M4. So I'm just going to load up the wiki here, and we're going to find out that its rate of fire: 700 to 950 rounds a minute for a fully automatic version. Now, I'm not sure if the Bushmaster that was used in this was a fully automatic or a semi-automatic, but we're still looking at, a massive increase in the speed at which you can get rounds out. And this is why I think it's important to take a look at the Constitution and consider the historical contexts that it was written in compared to the times we live in today. Now, the idea of being able to have a weapon for self-defense in America is intrinsic to their society. However, over the course of the past 200 years, a lot of Americans have not really kept up with the idea of it. Now, for an armed society, which is basically what America is set down to be, for an armed society to work, everyone has to be armed. And I think this is where you start seeing the issues currently with America, is that there are a lot of Americans, and for a good reason. I mean, do we really want to, or do we, I'm not even American, do Americans want to live in a society where it's required to walk around armed all the time? And I don't think lots of people do. There are people out there who do. There are people who think that that is the only way to live, and that's basically the society from a armed perspective that the Americans set up with the Constitution, was that everyone should be armed to defend themselves. If you take a look at a society like Great Britain, for instance, it's the exact opposite. And I mean, to the point where your average police officer is armed with a billy club, and that's it. And that's how you have to work in an unarmed society. It gets difficult where certain segments of an unarmed society are armed. So like law enforcement, for example. The dichotomy there is the people who are going around unarmed are to be protected by the state, obviously. The people who go around armed. However, if we take a look at Connecticut, for instance, the shooting started at, 9:40 in the morning, and the police were called at 9:41. Now, I'm not sure how quickly it took the police to get there. I would imagine they would have been hauling ass to get there, considering the situation. But you're still looking at a lot of time before the police were able to get there and stop. So I think, how do you stop something like this? I mean, looking at China, it's obvious that an event like this happening in 2 different places, just with different weapons, there's always going to be, with humans, the small minority who, for whatever reason, and I mean, take a look at Norway with Anders Breivik. There's always going to be segments of the population who feel that acts like this are necessary. And there's really no getting around that. We can try and approach our societal makeup to, instead of punishing people like this, to try and help them before they can even commit these terrible acts. And I think having good, accessible, and cheap mental health care is the best way to go about that. And we've got to remove the stigma associated with mental health as well. Vast segments of the population have mental health issues. We can't look at it as everyone who has a mental health issue is batshit crazy and is a danger and a threat to all those around them. That's one thing that society has to move towards. But I think America specifically needs to have a question of, do we still want our society to be founded on this principle where everyone is entitled to defend themselves? And if we do, then everyone has to exercise that right. That's the trick. Is that if that's the society you want, everyone in that society has to embrace it. And if people in that society, if that's not what they want, then they need to take a look at what they're doing that allows weapons like this to be accessible by anyone, and to think, is there something we can do to change it? How can we go about changing it? But that's a conversation and a question for the American society to have. There's no other way to approach it, and there's no other way to solve stuff like this than to have that conversation of what's the society we want and what's going on in our society that allows things like this to happen. I mean, I remember when Columbine happened. I was in high school when it happened, and I mean, that was such a devastating event. And at the time it seemed like such a unique event that something like that couldn't possibly happen again, because I mean, it was devastating. Absolutely devastating, not just to the community, but to the Western world as a whole. It's an event that really should have started this question, and yet it didn't. And there's been, the amount of school shootings that are going on now. It's insane. But until that question is addressed by American society, there won't be a solution, and events like this will probably continue to happen. But it's going to require not just a change in the ideals of gun ownership and what that means in relation to freedom, but also, how does a society like that address mental health? And how does a society like that want to deal with these very difficult questions? But until they ask that, things like this are going to continue to happen. And even once they do, like I say, the joys of the human condition, things like this are always going to happen. But how can societies limit the damage is really the question that needs to be asked. And are they ready to approach something like that? So, yeah, that's a downer of a question, but it's a very good question, Ielsis, and I really do hope that these questions start to be asked and start to be addressed, because until they do, things like this are going to continue to happen. So let's see, what else have we got? I think that handles those. Blowfly! Let's see. I like your comment here. I don't know much about Russian history, but I would guess his killing sprees. Yeah, pretty much. That's in relation to Stalin. As far as I know, Germany and Russia had pretty good relations before the war. I read somewhere that Russia even supported Germany and wanted peaceful coexistence. The thing is, if you take a look at the rise of Nazism in Germany in parallel with the rise of Bolshevikism in Russia, once the Nazis had Germany, their big rival was the communists. And both states initially took the opinion that their brand of socialism was the best brand of socialism. And initially, certainly, especially in Germany, the communists were the #1 enemy of the Nazis. And they certainly didn't get along well. Now, leading up to the war, there were very interesting geopolitical situations going on. And I'm going to just briefly take a digression to address your other comment. But I know near to nothing about history. Sadly, the only history teacher we had in my school got ill, and we never got a replacement. So we had no history classes. We stopped pretty much after Alexander. That has to be one of the most depressing comments I've ever read. History is important. And the fact that your school wasn't able to find you a replacement, hell, I'd be more than willing to take some German classes and go to Germany and teach history if that country is so hard up on history teachers. That is incredibly depressing. Especially in a country like Germany with such rich history, and with such history that requires in-depth understanding. It's still, the history of Germany of the 20th century still has so much import in current day politics and understanding that it's necessary, absolutely necessary, to have an understanding of what happened before. At the very least, to understand where the powerhouse of Europe is today. Now, going back to German-Russian relations, they certainly did not get along that well. However, once the Nazis were in power in Germany, it became clear that they obviously needed allies around the world, and they found like minds in Italy with Mussolini, obviously the father of fascism, and in Imperial Japan. Russia's an interesting case. So what you have in the 30s, you have both the Western allies and the fascist blocs courting Russia as a potential ally. Now, Russia has lots of raw materials. Germany, not so much. And when it came time to court them, there were two different approaches. The Western powers still weren't big fans of communism. And from their perspective, the fascist Germans were a bit less scary. Germany still had the semblances of a free market. They still had, diversified societies, and they didn't have a lot of anti-Western propaganda. In fact, a lot of the propaganda coming out of Germany at this time was very anti-communist. So when the West decided to try and bring the Russians onto their side, they sent the equivalent of the diplomatic B team, as it were, the prime foreign ministers, the top crust of German or of Western diplomats didn't go. They sent assistants and lower ministers to the Soviet Union to try and bring them on side. Now, the Germans, despite all the anti-communist propaganda that Hitler used very effectively to gain power, they sent their top guy. And Stalin appreciated that. Stalin felt that the West was snubbing him with the level of ministers that were going. Ribbentrop obviously was the top German diplomat, and you get the sense that Hitler understood very, very adequately that a two-front war is always bad for Germany. They're right in the middle of Europe. Two powers on either side of them, you can't fight both. And that's kind of a tenet of German military thinking, I would imagine, even to this day, although I highly doubt the Germans are planning a war with France. That would be mind-blowing if that ever happened. So, you see, despite the political rhetoric of both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany of being very anti each other, when it comes to diplomacy, they showed each other a very high level of respect. And that is where the beginnings of the Nazi-Soviet friendship, if we can use that term, stem from. And for sure, it certainly did appear that Stalin was friendly towards Hitler. Both sides, at the start of the war in 1939, both sides understood that they weren't strong enough to attack each other. And I think both held a date of around 1947 when either military would be prepared to fight each other. And so in 1941, it was apparent that the Nazis were quite busy in the West. They had Britain still left to deal with. They had their North African campaigns. And while they were going well for the Nazis, they were by no means finished. The Brits certainly held out. And I think anybody who takes a look at that situation militarily can see that it would have made much more sense for the Nazis to finish off the UK than it did for them to go against the Russians. And so you've got these reports near the beginning of Barbarossa, so in the weeks leading up to the Nazi invasion, of Soviet spies coming to Stalin and saying, hey, by the way, there are quite a few million Axis soldiers on the border. We kind of have this feeling that they're going to be pushing in. And Stalin would always dismiss this. He would say, no. They won't be ready until around 1947. They're not coming to attack us. Keep sending the goods. And up till the day of invasion, Soviet raw materials were flowing into Axis-held lands and into the factories of Germany. By order of Stalin, despite his intelligence agents saying, hold up, they're really coming, we should stop sending them things like oil, like gasoline, like food, we need to stop. Stalin wouldn't. Up until German forces crossed the border, goods were still flowing. And it's interesting. It shows a couple of things. Stalin, in his mind, was always right. So, never questioned the great leader. Hitler was obviously over-ambitious with his Barbarossa plans. That's a historical fact. And, yeah, I mean, how would the world look if Germany and Russia kept the peace? They wouldn't have kept the peace. Those two nations, well, especially Nazi Germany, was founded on the opinion and the belief that the German people needed more land, and it was going to get that land in the east. Now, the partition of Poland in 1939 provided a little bit of that, but Hitler's ambitions stemmed from, medieval German history. So the Teutonic Orders, the the expansion east to conquer the great rolling plains of the Slavic lands. So those two nations would have gone to war. What you would have seen is, a Germany without distractions in the West, and indeed with perhaps friendly governments in the West. Now, you would have still had issues with popular uprisings and dissatisfaction, especially in places like France and the UK, if indeed those were fascist puppets, which appeared to be Hitler's solution for the Western regime. So you can see in Vichy France, without the threat of the UK invading, I do believe that all of France and the Low Countries, so Holland and Belgium, places like that, would have just been puppets, basically. And the same with the UK. There would have been pro-fascist, pro-Axis governments. But you would have seen the might of, the Third Reich up against the might of the Soviet Union. It would have been an incredibly bloody and devastating war for both countries. I watched a very interesting documentary on the German nuclear developments, and what it looked like was, unlike the atom bomb that the Americans developed, the solution the Germans were going for was a bit more of a dirty bomb. So to have radioactive material inside a V2 rocket. And so you wouldn't have had the devastation of a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki, but you would have had thousands of nuclear capable V2 rockets being used in the East, and who knows what the Russians would have had. It would have been a devastating war, and one that, if things had gone this way, it depends on the Japanese not attacking Pearl Harbor, which is difficult to imagine they wouldn't have. It was integral to their plans to not have the U.S. pushing around in the Pacific. Japan wanted to dominate that region. But if you could have had a situation where the United States would have sat out of a war between Germany and the Soviet Union, it would have been devastating. And it definitely would have happened. It would have happened in the late 40s, early 50s. But it would have been absolutely devastating and atrocious. So while they were friends for a while, both sides knew that the friendship was never going to last, and it was a friendship of convenience for both sides, really. So yeah, I think that covers all the questions from the two videos. Let's just make sure. Supporting Israel, Italian front, school shootings. I'll answer the Monty Productions. I'll answer your Civ 5 question in Civ. I think I've already done what my favorite Civs are back with my Austria campaign, but I can't remember which specific video that would have been. So I'll give it an answer. I will say this. Ethiopia, go watch my Ethiopia campaign. It's not a Civ for me. So I'm glad it works for you. Does not work for me at all. And all I have to do is know what it sound like. You don't have to know what you're talking about. You only have to sound smart. Matt, that is a great quote. Question: did I sound smart in this video? I certainly hope I did. German-Soviet relations, Stalin, and I hope I did say the questions this time, Monty Productions. So yeah, hopefully this series continues. If you guys want to ask all your geopolitical / historical questions in this series, I'm going to do these as questions come up. And this one was a bit of a long one, but I hope you guys enjoy. So thank you all very much for watching. Thumbs up if you've enjoyed this series. Leave your questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, jokes, musings, what have you below. Again, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.